Hello, gentlemen, and welcome to another Palo V Market Research video. This is an important fucking video. I'm just going to be honest. This is a big deal of a video. If you can really understand what I'm talking about in this, you're really going to crush it. You're going to crush it in a way where you're just so confused how there's a zero being added to your bank account every time you watch another one of these videos, especially this one. You know what our goal here is? I want to turn you all into nine-figure motherfuckers as soon as possible so that you guys can go into the world and save it, because we need saving. Holy cow, Satanism everywhere. Now, let's do this. Let's just dive in because there's no time to waste. That's our goal. Let's fulfill it. So, in today's world, guys, there's no understanding where opportunities lie in the global macroeconomy without first understanding how the U.S. government funds its operations. We are taught that the government is funded by people paying taxes. And this used to be true back when we had a gold standard. But today, claiming the U.S. government generates its revenues primarily through taxpayers is a more absurd statement than claiming Starbucks makes all their money selling gift cards. Yes, they famously sell very profitable gift cards that people lose and then forget about, but it's still a tiny drop in the bucket relative to what Starbucks makes when selling products like coffee. So if the U.S. government isn't meaningfully using your tax dollars to pay for its operations, how are they paying for it? Where is this money coming from? And how does understanding this put you in an exceptional position to make a lot of money? So let's do what we do best. Let's follow the money. Now, the vast majority of the money that the U.S. government uses to pay for its expenses comes from selling the Treasury bonds issued by the U.S. Department of Treasury. That makes sense, right? And who is the biggest buyer of these Treasury bonds? Or put slightly differently, who is the Department of Treasury the most in debt to? Well, it's the Federal Reserve, which makes perfect sense, sort of. Being indebted to another pseudo-American governmental institution like the Federal Reserve is a hell of a lot better than being indebted to, say, China and the CCP. But that doesn't really matter. What matters has everything to do with how the Federal Reserve gets the liquidity to buy these bonds, especially during times like COVID or the 2007 financial crisis, where government's capital requirements were much higher. Their expenses shot through the roof. So the next question we need to ask is this: how does the Federal Reserve create the liquidity to buy bonds from the U.S. Treasury? Well, it's very simple. The Fed prints money using the Treasury bonds they already have on their balance sheet as some demented form of collateral. So let me recap and reframe this a bit. The U.S. Treasury goes into debt by selling bonds to pay for the U.S. government's expenses. Those expenses include making interest payments on the national debt. Its largest buyer of those bonds, when people buy those bonds, the debt becomes larger, and so the largest lender or buyer of those bonds is the Federal Reserve. But in recent history, the Federal Reserve has not had enough liquidity to buy the amount of Treasury bonds the U.S. Treasury needs to sell in order to cover their expenses. And those expenses include paying the interest on the bonds they have already sold. So what the Federal Reserve does to solve this problem is this: they reverse engineer what the U.S. Treasury needs to sell in a given year, and then they print dollars to fulfill that demand. To fulfill the demand of a predetermined supply that successfully addresses the U.S. government's capital requirements. But due to this methodology that the Fed is enlisting to create this liquidity, they're creating a cyclical and an exponential trend, and we can see that very clearly in the data. So if we look at this chart here, this is showing the relationship between the Fed's total liquidity and the federal government's expenditures and their projected expenditures and how they correlate. And they correlate very strongly. And you can see that, holy cow, the government's expenditures are about to go up. So liquidity injected by the Federal Reserve into global macroeconomy is about to continue to skyrocket, even though it already has skyrocketed, right? Okay, so now this is where things get interesting. How do we win? How do we win in the markets given these conditions? Well, we have to understand what it means to buy an asset. When you buy an asset, you are locking up liquidity so you can spend more later. In nerdy virgin speak, this is called future deferred consumption. It is the only reason any of us are investing. We lock up our liquidity in exchange for some form of ownership, which then necessarily requires some form of compensation in exchange. And the rate of return must gain relative to the forces that are taking value away from it. So what are the forces that are taking value away from the assets you own? So previous to 2008, this was quite simple to calculate with a high degree of confidence. Say you are realizing a gain from an investment you made in 1999 and you sell it in 2006. At this time, you would simply calculate the internal rate of return and then subtract 2% per year to understand what your average inflation-adjusted return was over that 7-year period. But that is no longer sufficient because between 2008 and today, the M1 money supply has gone up 1,379%. In 2008, the M1 supply was about 1.4 trillion, and as of December 2023, the M1 money supply sits at around 20.7 trillion, a 15x increase, okay? 15 times increase. But there's a subtle difference between how this increase in money supply and the way it's deployed in the economy via the Fed affects asset values and is not as simple as how we traditionally understand inflation because of how the Fed prints dollars it creates with the US Treasury. So this is where inflation becomes easily confused with debasement. Inflation, remember, relates to your purchasing power for goods and services going down. So it has to do with like your ability to consume in the economy. While the debasement of a currency relates to reducing its underlying value. It is easy to understand in the context of coinage, right? When one reduces the amount of precious metal in, say, a silver coin by cutting it down with cheaper metals while keeping the face value constant, that's what the debasement is. But what the Fed and the US Treasury are doing is they are leveraging paper dollar-backed treasuries to create more dollars, and then they invest those dollars back into treasuries. This is a more disturbing and more risky situation than what the Roman emperors were doing by cutting down the silver contents of a coin, right? So what does this all mean? Well, it means that when you are investing today and your asset isn't going up more than 8 to 8.5% per year, then you are actually losing money because asset values are debasing at that rate. And there is no escaping this because the value of nearly every asset on Earth is denominated in dollars. So you are in the red until you get above that 8%. This is why commercial real estate is so scary right now. Because with this 8% annual debasement, plus whatever your existing debt costs are, say at 6%, you need an IRR above 14% to get back to zero, right? So meaning a 15% IRR on paper is now in real terms, a 1% IRR for, say, a commercial real estate asset, especially in the context of office spaces in blue states where leases have become less reliable and accessible. But there are some great takeaways here. Or to put it another way, some great probabilistic assumptions we can build on top of with a great deal of confidence. So, assumption 1 is that the government can print its own currency to pay off its debts. We know that. And it has developed a clear preference for doing so opposed to other methods that are available to them. Okay? Assumption 2 is that the GDP will continue to grow below 3.5% to 4%. And we can be relatively certain that we will not go above 3.5% to 4% in terms of GDP growth because really it won't happen until the baby boomers die, let's just be honest. So we can fairly assume that the Fed will continue to pay down the debts of the US Treasury while covering their expenses. This way, covering their expenses this way by this Ponzi scheme that I'm describing effectively, until we experience extreme economic growth. And we will define extreme economic growth for the purposes of this video to be a GDP rate above 4%. So they have to basically, to sum that up, in order for them, the federal government, to continue to pay for its expenses with the current economic growth we have, they have to continue to enlist this strategy until we have extreme economic growth, which is possible for the U.S. government to achieve. But it's very unlikely because it'll happen 8 to 10 years from now when AI, robotics, and their essential infrastructure is widely set up for commercial and consumer products. But that all assumes that we are competent enough to double our total electricity production over that time period, which in my opinion is highly, highly debatable. This leads myself and others much smarter than me to believe that the global economy in the short to medium term will continue to gain exponentially relative to an economy that can't grow faster than the debt it accumulates. If we take a look at this chart, we see the federal government's projected expenses and the correlation between those expenses and the Federal Reserve's liquidity, right? Now, this is the most important part. This means, well, that the most profitable places to put your money are in systems that exist outside of, let me reframe this a bit. So, given these conditions, where are the most profitable places to put your money, right? Well, it has to be as outside of this debasement process as possible. I personally found that international dividend-paying stocks that trade under different currencies like the Swedish krona are very interesting, especially ones in industries that relate to manufacturing advanced materials for aerospace and technology. Another option is, of course, cryptocurrencies, namely layer ones that follow analogous adoption curves to Solana and Ethereum. So if you're looking at maybe Neo, I don't even know, or Algorand, there are these other smaller layer ones. And if you literally overlay these charts over Solana or Ethereum and study their adoption curves and their network effects, you're going to be in an awesome position to fucking win, baby. So I just want to say, if being educated on opportunities like those, Neo, Algorand, these other opportunities that we're tracking here at Palaview, I would highly encourage you all to join a free trial on our newsletter. Links to that are in our description. And guys, I've never asked this before, but come on, share, like, subscribe. That is today's video. You guys are awesome. Thank you so much. And peace and victory. All right. Later, guys. Later.